for all their work, for preparing and getting us together for today. This panel is designed to shed light on real estate and the options for young companies from their earliest stages up through and post their IPO. In my days as a life science VC, I was aware of this topic, but did not really have the experience of negotiating leases and thinking about space to provide informed advice. So I generally stayed quiet and I left it to management to manage the situation. And in many cases, they did not have much more experience than I did. So we thought we'd take this opportunity to bring some real estate professionals and experienced people in the field to provide those insights. We do have the ability to take questions as we're going through the panel, as we're going through the discussion. So please send them to us through the chat or to me through the chat, and I will share them with our panelists, either weaving them in with our discussion or as Q&A at the end. With us today, we're fortunate to have a stellar panel. I really am pleased that we got such a nice group together, knowledgeable, good people to work with. First, we have Steele DiVitto, who's founder of the Steele Group. He represents life sciences companies looking for space. He was formerly at T3 and Cushman Wakefield. He is, in addition to real estate, he's a skilled and ruthless paintball player. We have Martha Farmer. She's the founder of the North Shore Innoventures, an incubator. I met Martha 30 years ago when I was an MBA student visiting Baxter, and she was running a very visible and important program there. A little bit about North Shore Innoventures. It was founded in 2008. It's at Cummings Center in Beverly, Mass. with 19,000 square feet, 18 tenants, 25 alumni companies. The companies there have raised over $500 million, or should I say $500 million. And around that facility in Beverly, there's a growing life science clusters. So she has a lot of relevant experience in the incubator, but also in the graduating from the incubator area. Finally, we're fortunate to have with us Rick Strong. He's the Senior Director of Pharmaceuticals at Frequency Therapeutics. He was there at the founding. The company is developing regenerative approaches for hearing loss. The company now has gone public. It's a C2I alumni, and it's now an 80-person organization. Just a little bit about C2I, and then we'll get into this. C2I is located in Woburn, Mass. It was founded in 2013, has 20,000 square feet with 10 tenants. 39 alumni life science companies, of which 2 have gone public. The companies and the alumni have raised over $750 million. So let's get into it right now. I'd like to begin with a question for Steele. Steele, what is the situation in Eastern Mass for life science space? I know it is expensive, but tell us more about it. What's the situation?
Yeah, well, Andrew, thanks for coordinating. Certainly, I'm excited to spend the day next hour with Rick, Martha, and the team, and so it's a fun opportunity. So the life science market is incredibly active. I'd say, there's a lot of statistics floating around, but I would say demand is certainly outpacing supply. If you're a company that needs lab space in the next 12 to 18 months, there's a pretty slim list of opportunities. So what we're seeing right now is there's a bit of a bubble as far as the amount of construction getting delivered between 2024 and 2025, which is a long ways out, right? So you'll see in the pipeline, I mean, there could be upwards of 50 to 55 million square feet getting delivered in that time period, but likely it's going to be, it'll likely be 25 to 30 million square feet. And that's anything from new construction to office to lab conversions to just existing tenants moving to larger spaces. So very competitive market. We've certainly seen owners with the understanding that they have life science buildings delivering in 2022 find ways to upcharge rent in some ways, right? Because they understand that it's so limited. To give you a gauge, There's a building over in Watertown that we were looking at a ways back with a client where the rent was $78 a foot. Fast forward, 4 weeks later or 4 months later, and now it's in the mid 90s net. So expensive, very short supply, but it's coming. It's coming, and I think if you can find creative solutions to get to those, later 23 into that 2023 and beyond tranche, you're in good shape. But right now, there's a lot of groups who have needed to find ways to either bunker up together, just to find lab benches. They've certainly, I think, location in some ways isn't necessarily always driving the requirement. A lot of it's based on availability. And especially younger stage companies that are taking this step out of the C2I, going into a much larger facility. This is a big and important step for them, and it's very competitive to find these kind of immediately ready lab suites. There's not a lot of them. So hopefully that's some good perspective.
Thank you, Rick. You went through the whole process with Frequency. There were 4 guys there when you started out. Can you walk us through the evolution of your space needs for your company and how you thought about it and the decision points you came upon and how you...
Sure, absolutely. So my first experience with Frequency is actually when I was hired. We had rented a couple of lab benches and access to a hood at an incubator space. And one of the things that I don't know if everybody understands, the value of incubator space is that they're already an established facility. They have all their permitting in place. They have the infrastructure as far as equipment there. They have a plan for waste disposal. So really all you have to worry about is doing your science and not have to worry about the facilities related issues that go along with a laboratory space. From Frequency's point of view, we've moved from an incubator space in Woburn. That was about after almost a year. We moved to a site in Woburn as well that was a little larger. And now in the past 4 months, we've actually relocated again to a larger facility in Lexington. And so we're actually at a point where we have about 80 full-time employees, which is an order of magnitude above where we were when I first started, right? So the main things that you have to, I think, as a aspiring CEO or a leader of an organization, you have to kind of thread the needle between having a plan for if you're wildly successful and balancing that against a plan if you have setbacks, right? And so the lab facility is really important for that. Certainly, if you're successful, you're going to have to expand headcount, and then you're going to have a place where people can do their research, right? So I think that's the main issue or the main concern as far as how to forecast where you're going as a company in the short term and in the near term as well, right? And so in our facility right now, we have space for research groups and development groups. And when you're in a small incubator space, you really have to share all the space that you have. So you have to really plan out what your lab needs are and the spaces that are available.
What was the moment when you said our company is large enough that we need to move out of the incubator and get our own space? What?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Certainly, finances are important. You have to be able to afford where you're going. At that time, we moved out of the incubator space and we relocated to another larger facility in Woburn. My recollection was that the rent rate in Cambridge was 3 times what we were asked to pay in Woburn, right? So certainly one of the assets you have as a startup or limited assets you have is financing. And so you really have to find ways to stretch your dollar. And for Frequency, the move really depended upon, we're at a point where we were getting ready for clinical trials and we had to bring on additional staff to help manage those processes. And so therefore we did outgrow our incubator space. And that's kind of where you have to kind of figure out where you are, right? So certainly cost and finances are very, very important to going out and getting a larger facility, headcount, costs associated with that as well. So that's kind of where the threshold is. If you're having success as far as being able to raise capital and you're looking to bring your group or your company in the next stage of development, that's pretty much the gateway to change. But you have to kind of anticipate that as Steele said, 6 to 18 months in advance, because the availability of space is really limited right now. So you have to really have a crystal ball and a willingness to take a risk.
Did you ever consider having two facilities with your lab people in one and your other functions in office space? Or
so it's an interesting point. When I first joined the company, we had a lot of the business leaders were renting a office, I think, down at Mass Bio in Kendall Square. We had one incubator space in Woburn, and then we actually had another incubator space associated with the University of Connecticut in Farmington, Connecticut. So that's kind of where the research group was. The development group was in Woburn. And then when we merged or went to a larger space in Woburn, that incubator space in Connecticut still stayed in place until we finally consolidate a lot of our operations into the Lexington site we're at now.
And did that work with people in different places? Well, obviously you've gone public, so it wasn't a disaster, that's for sure. But how'd that work? Did it work? Would you do it again?
Well, it's necessity, right? So you have to, find your space where it's available. And certainly being in Connecticut wasn't ideal, but it's certainly within travel distance. So there were many times where a group from Massachusetts would go down to Connecticut and vice versa. The Connecticut team would come up to Massachusetts. And certainly with the increase in technology as far as virtual meetings, you can definitely make it happen.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, I would say, just to piggyback on that, I mean, it's, the hardest thing with, the company scales is obviously there's the availability piece of it and price. But it's also the cultural integration is also challenging, when you have bifurcated operations. And it sounds like Rick and your team did a pretty good job of managing that throughout the process, right?
Yeah.
Which can be a challenge.
Yeah. Now, in the age of COVID, where travel between states wasn't always possible,
Right.
We started back before all that, and so it was a much easier. I think
Right.
the challenges of having different spaces is more so now if you're not allowed to travel to meet with people.
I'd like to chime in on one thing about this, which is, although this is a seminar about space, I suspect your decisions around Connecticut were driven by people. And the most important asset that you have in your company, besides your initial idea and your IP, is going to be the people that you're bringing in. And that often drives a lot of the space decisions. So, and I'm sure, for instance, the Connecticut Research Group was oriented around a group of people who were already there, who weren't about to move up to Woburn. So
You're absolutely correct, Martha.
Yeah.
Martha, when is it time for a life sciences startup to move out of the proverbial garage and to begin thinking about space for the first time? And what should they be looking for in that first space?
I was thinking about this question. The proverbial garage works pretty well if you're developing software, even if you're developing hardware, which some life sciences companies can do for a while. But at a point, if you're involved in biotech, you're going to need a lab. And you can farm it out to other people, but most of the time you're going to want a lab. And the decision about when it's time, when you really need the lab, actually shouldn't happen first. It should happen after you've got a reasonably good idea of the business and what you're going to have to do in a lab. And you'd be surprised how many people just want to get into the lab really fast before they actually have their business concept fully put together. So, but at a point where you need a lab, there are a lot of things you got to take into account. Safety is actually a really important one. If you're going to be doing biotech, you're probably going to need a biosafety level 2 lab. Heaven forbid you need anything higher than that, but biosafety level 2 requires permitting. It requires, so if you're working with recombinant DNA, there are very specialized permits required. So you need to have an understanding of what it's going to take to set up a lab and to operate a lab and to have safe operations. And I'd say, obviously I have a bias toward incubators, but there are some, some important reasons for looking for that. One of the reasons is that lab operations will largely be taken care of by the incubator staff. So somebody else will handle getting the HVAC repaired or getting the hoods certified or whatever is required in an incubator. When you move into your own space, when you're ready, as Rick's company was, to move into their own space, there are a whole lot of new responsibilities your company will have to shoulder. So planning for stretching your dollars as long as you can, and the importance of signing up for space that gives you some flexibility. This won't be the first, this is only the first lab or the first space you'll take. You're going to grow, and you need to have the option to grow. So you don't want to sign a 5-year lease. Even if you've got a reasonable amount of funding, you want something that's a shorter term than that, so that you have the flexibility to grow. Or if your growth plan does not quite meet your expectations, you don't want to be what they call house poor, right? So because your people are going to be the huge asset that you need. So I do think that there are a lot of creative options. Incubators is certainly one of them. Everybody says about real estate, location, but this is only your first location. And while Cambridge might be the top location in biotech, it's not a rational place to start if you're at a very early stage and still funded with friends and family instead of, venture capital. So looking for the less expensive places and for shared space is, we'll talk more about the advantages and disadvantages of shared space, but shared space with shared equipment can reduce your costs a lot. And that's what incubators in general have to offer.
Martha, you mentioned that people are very anxious to get going and start the clinical work. Do they have a shopping list of we're going to need these 6 instruments and this is what we're going to need? Do they know that up front? Or do you guide them to that? I'm curious, what level of expertise and do they come in with a list and say, we're going to need this mass spec or this and this and this? Do you have it? How does that kind of equipment need, availability plan lay out, and how's that? Does it work? And are there things new tenants can do better?
Well, it really depends on the stage of the entrepreneur. I mean, if it's 2 people and a dog, they don't necessarily know all of the things they're going to need. They may very well have a good idea of the equipment they're going to need, because most of these startup companies are started by scientists. They know how to do their science. They have they may come out of an academic lab, although I actually see far more of the companies started by people who are coming out of industry. It's probably 2 to 1 industry to academic backgrounds. So, but they understand their science. And so they have a pretty good idea of the equipment they're going to need and what will do, even if they can't get what they absolutely want. So looking for that equipment, finding it. I mean, if you're starting off and you want to take space of your own and you're not in an incubator, you're going to have to buy all that. Buying used equipment, the service contracts on equipment, on a mass spec service contract can be $25,000 a year. And you get a couple of 3 instruments like that, and it's really, it chews through your cash fast. So yes, if there is shared equipment, that is often exactly what draws people to an incubator. C2I has NMR capability. That's practically non-existent anywhere else in the area. We have 3 mass specs, maybe 4 now in Beverly at the incubator there at North Shore Innoventures, and those kinds of requirements can be, depending on what a company is trying to do, they may need a very specialized type of equipment.
So equipment availability is one advantage. Are there other advantages and disadvantages of incubators, Martha, Rick?
Yeah, one thing I'd particularly say about that is that it's not all about space. If incubators are much more than a place to be, They should provide things like this. This is a seminar that I hope a lot of the incubatees are listening to. You get an advisory board put together around your company to help you with a lot of connections. You may know how to do your science, but you probably have a long way to go in developing the business and developing a pitch that you can pitch to investors. All of that kind of support. Most good incubators provide a whole lot more than just space support. So that's one of the bigger advantages. One of the disadvantages is that generally you are in fact sharing this space, and so there are issues of maintaining confidentiality. It's actually turned out to be much less of a problem than I might have guessed it would have been. People are actually only interested in what it is they are doing for the most part. So you don't seem to have that much trouble from that. I mean, I'd be interested, Rick, you experienced that. You were in shared space. Was that ever an issue?
So at Frequency, every employee was issued a laptop, and that's where you kept a lot of your notes and things like that. And so employees brought their laptops home with them in case they weren't able to attend the office the next day. They had their laptops with them. And then we did have paper notebooks, but those were kept under lock and key in a filing cabinet at the end of the night. And I have to agree with you, Martha. I had absolutely no concerns with our other tenants as far as, we're all in this, all in a similar situation. We're all trying to get our science forward. And so you really don't have time for snooping around or anything like that. I didn't experience any of that. And honestly, the people that were there as well, I thought they were trustworthy and all, striving for the same things. And so I never experienced a situation like that. So that's just been my experience.
Yeah, that's been my experience throughout the 12 years. It just hasn't been an issue. It worries people to start with. Yeah. They come in and they're nervous about that, but it hasn't been a problem.
But by the same token, I do think you need a strong intellectual property position. So you need to work with lawyers, patent your ideas, document your ideas in notebooks with signatures, and those are very important, right? But certainly as far as industrial espionage, I didn't experience much of that at all.
Yeah.
It's interesting. When I was at Siemens, people would say, "Oh, we don't want Siemens to follow up on our idea," and I'd look at them and I'd think to myself, or I'd often tell them, "Look, our R&D dollars are all committed for 2 years. Our R&D plans for the key products were laid out for 3 years, and there wasn't money laying around to do new fun projects because they're fun." So if they had IP, Rick, I used to be like, it's not worth worrying about.
Well, the IP also becomes an asset for your company, right? So it could be, if you decide to partner, which you may need to at some point, or if you just want to maybe get to your company to a certain stage and then sell, that IP position becomes an asset that you can actually use to meet your business needs.
Mm-hmm. Steele, when I presume you have some young companies come to you looking for space. Do you have what's your standard line when people are looking at incubator versus just plain rented space? What do you tell them?
Well, I think there's kind of two fundamental differences. I think Martha and Rick hit some really important ones, right? Obviously, earlier stage companies, flexibility is really nice. Costs are important. It really depends on how we define early stage, obviously. It could be a Series A company that's raised $100 million, right? And sometimes they're a little more bullish. And then also it has to do with the way their team's actually set up, right? Where the departments look like, and then what level of equipment do they need, and what type of infrastructure is required for that equipment, right? Some companies we work with have really aggressive headcount growth, right? Or headcount plans early in inception. But I would say, the incubator model, sometimes the nice thing about it is the contracts are also fairly short. So your ability to actually getting quickly, the path there is pretty clear, right? I think most of the time it's not really looked at as a long-term strategy, right? It's really kind of a short-term, get you to the next phase. And also, a lot of incubators, sometimes some incubators offer certain packages and some incubators don't, right? Sometimes it's more of just a true lab space environment. And other ones, we actually give you certain levels of equipment that are, really helpful to run your business, right? So we try to really help companies that are kind of those tweeners of, do we take our own space? Do we go into an incubator? We help them really understand, what's actually required. And then also what all the incubators provide, right? There's certain levels of services at each one. And then from there, if they do in fact decide to go the course of taking on their own space, right? There's a lot of the times when you take on your own space, term is required. The reason term is required is because it's very expensive to build labs. So that capital needs to be actually amortized over a certain length of term, of lease term. So it is not, unfortunately, there aren't 23 or 2-year subleases on the market. Many times you have to make concessions, in order to get the right space that you want, which also comes with some level of risk on the back end, right? So if you're not going to go the incubator route, subleasing is always a viable option. Granted, there's not many subleases, and then if you're going into a direct deal, you're either kind of assuming you might sublease it on the back end, or you might be going into, a bit of a landlord partnership where they have a big portfolio of assets and you can basically grow within their portfolio. So a couple of the marquee players, right, are Alexandria, Biomed, Phase 3. The list keeps growing because everyone's trying to get to life science development. But the flexibility to grow and upgrade within portfolios is also a strategy we see a lot of companies doing.
Someone like you could walk a company through that process and guide them along.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting though. I mean, it all starts with really this needs assessment phase, right? Understanding really what you need and why you need it, right? It comes down to people, it comes down to equipment, it comes down to infrastructure, and then you start to layer on location, right? And the big thing, as we talked about earlier, there's not a lot of supply. So how do we really manage location and timing, right? Those are really big. They're really big topics right now. And then from there, you start to, when you really understand what your needs are, then you go out to the market and you say, okay, here's the options we can evaluate. And then from there, it's a function of negotiations, running a great process, and then ensuring, ultimately when you sign a deal, whether it's within an incubator space, a sublease, a direct space, that the space gets properly implemented, right? We don't just kind of pass you off and good luck to you, right? Here's the keys. You can implement it yourself. So the ability to implement space is very important as well. And it's a long process. I mean, I would say, I think that was one of the questions that probably came up, if you were to take space on your own, in an ideal world, you can get it in 6 months, but a lot of the times it's a 9 to 12-month process if you really do it the right way. Construction it takes a long time, right? Between drawings and permitting and then the actual construction itself. And who knows? I mean, supply chain right now is a little bit all over the place. It seems to be recovering a little bit, but it's, we're looking at, 10 weeks on a VAV box right now for a small company that we're trying to, solve for. So it's just, everything's behind right now. So the more time I think you can allot your company through the process, it helps. And it also helps you to take the time to actually analyze the data, some key data points to help you really with, create an informed decision-making strategy, right? Versus just making decisions based on market availability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Earlier, you touched on location, and we talked about Cambridge being a 3x premium, and all I can say is, wow. In home investing, they say location, location, location. But how do people think about location? How should they think about location? Are people willing to travel? And also, is Cambridge worth the premium and also the headaches of getting in and out of there?
Well, I think it depends on your company, right? Some companies, it seems like it's very important, whether it's from the venture fund that's invested in them or just the local team, that they want to be very close to MIT. Some companies, I know Rick, a lot of your team is senior as well, right? So, Woburn and, kind of that 128 belt carried you fairly well. So I think it comes down to really people. I'd say we just talked about like availability, timeline of availability, right? A lot of the reality is availability, the timing of availability is driving a lot of these requirements, driving a lot of these companies a little bit further out of the city, right? But Cambridge, if you really do break down the kind of large users in Cambridge, they are the typical large pharma, large tech, big tech users, right? Those groups are really taking on most of the footprint. I mean, if you look at even what's going on, just from a pricing perspective, I mean, One Rogers, which was the former Pegasystems building, was bought by Davis Companies about 6-7 months ago for about $400 million. Alexandria's coming right behind it, and they're buying it from Davis Companies for $800 million.
Wow.
Later. Yep. And ARE has Moderna and Flagship in their back pocket, right? So there's the other piece of it as well. If you're trying to stay very close to Cambridge, is Flagship is taking down a decent amount of space, and they've also expanded out to Watertown, right? They're working through a Watertown deal right now as well. So we've seen the flagships of the world, take down large footprints to accommodate a lot of their portfolio, given how much actual square footage their portfolio is taking, right?
Yeah.
So there's certainly, we talk about competition. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of groups who are trying to get creative. And is Cambridge worth premium? I mean, I think you need some data points to support that, right? Whether it makes sense for you or not. Maybe you do have some really critical hires that are coming out of MIT that if it's either your company or another company, and location is that important, right? But I think there's companies that have had a lot of success establishing themselves further outside of the city, certainly. Yeah, go ahead.
Rick, did you consider Cambridge? Did you look at it, or when you were post-IPO looking at space, or?
Well, I wasn't intimately involved in those discussions, but I know that the cost premium for working in Cambridge pretty much made the decision much easier to go outside the city.
Right.
I know that in Lab Central, for instance, is an incubator in Cambridge. It's terrific. It's very, very well equipped. They have a lot of really good opportunities there, but it is 3 or 4 times the price of a C2I or a North Shore Innoventures. So Cambridge real estate is so expensive, but it boils down to people choose it because the people they want working in their company often don't have cars. And so people are going to be depending on public transportation, and they live in Cambridge because they're associated with Harvard or MIT or whatever. So that has driven people to stay in the city. But there's a point at which that decision, I can understand it if you're working on a therapeutic and you want to have real involvement with the clinical research capabilities of the universities there. But if you are heading toward manufacturing, nobody manufactures in Cambridge. It just doesn't make sense to do R&D in Cambridge or Boston even. Yes, maybe, but if you're moving toward manufacturing, you're going to be looking at the outer districts, and Framingham and Marlborough and Woburn and Beverly and even Gloucester. The real estate is much less expensive, and you need so many more square feet for that. And you need a different group of people to work for you in those spaces. So workforce availability is a really key element of your location decision and the kind of workforce you need. So
and just to give a little context on pricing, right? So Kendall's pushing a deal right now about $125 a foot, $125 a foot triple net, right? Which is, doesn't include your operating expense. That's a triple net lease, doesn't include your operating expenses, utilities, CAM real estate taxes.
So all in, what would you say? Something it's 125 when you add
about 150, yeah, about $150 a foot. And then if I took 19 Presidential, actually, Rick, your former space, a piece of your former space at 19 Presidential is currently on the market. It's 30% lab, 50% or 70% office. So it's not the best, it's not a great lab ratio, but it's going to be, a high 50s triple net deal. Nets are a little bit lower there. They're probably closer to $10, $15 a foot. But it's obviously that's a big price difference, right?
Cummins in Beverly, for comparison, is about $27 a square foot for built-out labs. So it's a fourth the price.
Yeah. And then a lot of this comes down to as well, right? Like there's certain owners, I think, who identified that these younger companies aren't really interested in doing 10-year leases, right? So, for example, a company called Phase 3, which is really a West Coast-based developer, backed by Bain, they've been going into buildings and purchasing buildings and building speculative suites out, assuming they're going to do 5 to 7 year deals on them, which is a pretty cool model in itself, right? So they'll when I say turnkey, they'll build the space out almost to the condition, lab benches, casework, almost everything included. All your page is tied in, backup power, everything you typically need as a user, right? And if there's additional items you need, they'll do it. But I think a lot of owners are starting to identify that, there's a kind of a gap between the long-term commitment in the incubator spaces, and there's kind of groups who are trying to fill in right in between. So, which is good to see.
Great. We're talking about costs and space and how to manage this, and for these companies, is there an opportunity for companies to outsource with CROs and use more of a virtual model? Periodically, I'll hear of a company in the public realm that's trying to do everything virtual and outsource everything. But how does that work? What's the panel's view on using outsourcing various services to kind of lower their internal workload? Go ahead.
I'll speak up. If you can get somebody else to do it who is really good at what it is that you want done, it's cheaper to buy than to make on the whole. So it is often better to outsource. There are some things you're not going to be able to outsource. Those are the things that are most important for you to do yourself. But outsourcing is a perfectly reasonable model. Doing everything outsourced, I do know one company that is run by one employee, one person, and she outsources everything. And it's a lonely business. I can't see it. I think that the value of a team that is working together is huge, but there are many things that can be outsourced, and it's a good idea. Rick, I'm sure you guys outsource plenty.
Yeah, so for if you're a small company, when you do GMP manufacturing, that's got to be completely outsourced. You're not going to build a manufacturing facility for your products, right? But I don't disagree that, getting CROs involved, even, research organizations is a way to go, but there are some challenges you'll have to expect. So for example, nobody's going to care about your project as much as you do, right? At a CRO, you are just one of other clients that they have. Sometimes the workforce at that CRO changes. So a lot of that institutional knowledge that you may build up on a project goes with them, and you'll have to work with somebody to retrain them exactly how to do things. That's one challenge. When I was at a larger pharma, I had contacts at CROs that I could email, they get back to me. When I became a startup, they didn't know who I was anymore, right? Because you're a startup and you don't necessarily have the track record as far as finances that you can use or the leverage of a larger company that you can use to get those spaces that you want, right? So it can be done, but you may have to hunt around looking for that lab or that organization that can meet your needs and actually will show you the attention and expertise that you'll need to be successful. There are challenges. You can do it, but there are challenges. Yeah.
Animal studies are one of those things that's probably better to farm out. It is painfully expensive to run an animal facility and to get it certified and all that. And people often come to us looking for that, and we never supported it, and they don't have it at C2I. So it's really, that's better to find somebody who's has expertise to do that work for you.
Yeah, I would
And-
wholeheartedly agree. Toxicology and GMP manufacturing are things that you can't do in-house. You have to find people to do those for you.
Yeah, and as far as ACFs go, there's, you know, MISPRO has always been a big player, but there's another group that's entered the market called Explora, who's, you know, kind of, they're a little bit of a step up, I'd say, from MISPRO, but they're actively looking at different opportunities, and they're looking at not only taking down their own space and just building it out to provide for kind of those on-demand ACFs, but also looking into, if you were a big company and you were taking down a big footprint, you could come in and actually operate within your space. They could operate your ACF for you, because there's obviously staffing and there's equipment that gets correlated, not only from the infrastructure is not only required, a certain level of infrastructure for these ACFs are only required, but also the actual cages and staffing is also a big cost as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, if anyone needs squirrels, we've got plenty of them. I'll deliver. What about, are there rules of thumb for cost? Is it, you know, do you say you need, and for cost and for space, you need X number of square feet per person, or X number of square feet lab feet? For each scientist, you need a certain number of square feet of lab space. Is lab space, what's the premium of lab space versus office space? Are there rules to think about, or that rules of thumb that you can use to kind of help think about this if you're early on?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of it comes down to your program, Andrew, right? So, you know, what are you actually trying to solve for? How much equipment do you have? I mean, there's some users who have very low headcount, but they have a lot of equipment, which requires them to take on more space, right? I mean, you could use a general 400 square feet per person for lab or something of that extent, but I think typically it comes down to how many people you're looking to hire, and, you know, how much equipment you are planning for. What's your CapEx allocation look like for the next couple of years? And then the other piece of it as well is, you know, this whole integration of the lab and the office, right? Does every person have a bench? Does every person have a bench in an office station, right? So these types of components are really important to be, you know, important to think through. I think today, you know, we live in more of a hybrid environment, so the ability to adapt to not necessarily having one desk tied to one bench, I think is probably much more doable given the past 18 months or so. You know, and then as far as costing goes, most landlords will typically charge, and Martha can probably speak to more of the incubator model, but most landlords will typically charge a lab rent, regardless if you're leasing office space and lab space. The reason for that typically comes down to the actual tenant improvement requirements, right? The amount of infrastructure that's correlated to the lab. You want your money to go as far as possible, so you want to capture as much construction dollars and concessions as possible and correlated, right? And that's how lab landlords typically do it. The good thing is that, you know, the lab ratios have certainly increased over time. I think a lot of the new programming, right? So what happens is a landlord will typically deliver you a certain level of infrastructure as part of the deal, right? They call it the base building delivery package. And the infrastructure, I'd say that list has certainly increased in many ways, which is positive. And also the lab ratios have gone from, you know, 40 to 50 to 60%. 60% lab to office ratio is seeming like it's becoming more of a standard, which is good, which is, you know, you're paying lab rent, so you should hopefully have more lab space, right? Hopefully that's a little bit of context. Martha and Rick, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would actually, because working with Cummings Properties it's a little bit unusual. The 100 Cummings building in Beverly is about 1.4 million square feet. And on site, they have about, I think it's 2.5 million square feet, because they have several other buildings in there. And about 500,000 square feet of that is rented by life sciences companies now. So it's a mixed, lots of other things going on in the space, But what companies frequently will do is there are sometimes available labs, and they'll rent a lab space and then rent an office space like next door or across the hall. And the rent for the office space is on the order of half the price of the lab space. So, so you can do a hybrid where you're paying for what you actually need. And that we've actually had a number of the companies that have come out of our incubator graduate and move down the hall for a couple of good reasons. I mean, they've already got their workforce is accustomed to coming there. That's part of it. But they still have access to some of the equipment potentially in the incubator, or to, they know there's now something like 60 or 70 life sciences companies on site there. And we've actually formed something of a community. I mean, one company's lab water system went down, and they came and borrowed water from us, and somebody else's freezer came down and we took their samples in, and vice versa. So having a cooperative neighborhood has been quite valuable. It's a relatively unusual arrangement, I think. But the other, I've got to put in a plug for Cummings, because they've been very good to work with for us. And when a company needs to grow, if you've got a 5-year lease and they've built out the space for you, most places you're stuck in that lease. With Cummings, if you are growing, they will find you another space in a Cummings building for you to take more space. So they'll grow with you, and they'll let you out of your 5-year lease if you're going to take a similar sort of a lease in a larger space. So it's that flexibility that has been very helpful to people.
So they'll let you trade up.
They'll let you trade up. They won't let you trade down.
Mm-hmm.
they are there to make money, but they do it quite reasonably. And and they also have a byline these days that their Cummings properties, the profits are go into a foundation, and they give many millions of dollars away every year.
So I've seen that.
Cummings has turned into quite the philanthropist, so it's it's a good organization to support.
We touched upon timelines earlier, Steele, and in this conversation about thinking about the moves and trading up. Rick, you've been through a couple of these moves, and when you start a move, when is the time to begin thinking about moving up in size? And how do you start that whole process? What are the first 3 things someone should do when they're thinking about taking their life sciences company to a new, larger facility?
I think it does depend upon what you see as a long-term plan. A long-term, I'm talking about 2 or 3 years, right, for a startup. So when I first joined a startup, it was really 6 months to 6 months, right, depending on how the funding went. And then once you get a little bit more established, it's more of a yearly basis, and then you start working toward 2 or 3 years out. Certainly, I think when your headcount is approaching your occupancy limit, that is a good time to take a hard assessment as far as where we're going to be in 6 months, a year from now, and start planning out ahead. You don't want to wait until you're at a critical mass and then start wondering where your next space is, because you'll end up having people stuffed together and working on top of each other. And that's not necessarily, in the laboratory, that's not necessarily safe or conducive for a lot of good science to be done. So it's tricky. It's situational dependence. But again, you have to plan for success. And if your project's going to go forward and you see it's going to go forward in the clinic, you need to start, staffing your facility, or getting a facility that's commensurate with that progress.
What about people? You've changed locations, not in a big way, but you mentioned earlier you had employees in Connecticut. Are people willing to move? Are they willing to travel? I always hear the Cambridge people are only willing to go a few blocks. kind of what are you seeing out there in terms of the adaptability of your employee base, and are people, what are your thoughts there?
So I'll only speak from Frequency's perspective, right? A lot of the younger employees that we have are in Cambridge, right? Or in Boston, or any of those communities in the greater Boston area that are catered to or attract young professionals. There's a lot of people out there as well. But there are people with a lot of families, and they're more located in the suburbs, right? So, you know, the individual who's going to work at a startup has to have an adventurous spirit, right? There's nothing guaranteed. So you really have to attract that person who really is on board with the startup mentality. And I think you can find people of all demographics and locations to do that. Now, the people who live in the suburbs, they're used to commuting. For me personally, I live, you know, in the Merrimack Valley. And so I did the Cambridge run for about 20 years, and I'm more than happy to stay out in the suburbs, right? And I think there's a healthy number of people in that same environment. But like I said, the recent graduates that we hire, they are in Cambridge, right? And so for them, their challenge is getting a vehicle to get to where we are. You can take public transportation. There is an option. There are shuttle buses that go from our facility to the Alewife station, but I think most people prefer to work on their own schedule and commute on their own schedule as well.
What about on the North Shore in Beverly, Martha? How's the employee situation up there?
Well, it's you know, it's really beautiful up here. So the one of the advantages is kind of a lifestyle advantage, because you're right on the water. You know, and the communities are all in that, not far from the water, which is attractive to a lot of people. And there's I mean, housing is short everywhere in Massachusetts, and but there are neighborhoods that are quite affordable, and that helps. We have most of the, I mean, we have a fellow who is a surgeon at MGH, thoracic surgeon at MGH, who lives in Wenham, right down the street from Beverly, and he wanted to start a company, and we were extremely convenient for him, so that has helped. And there are a lot of biotech executives that live up here and commute every day into Cambridge, and is one of the reasons actually we started the incubator long ago, was because a lot of us were, I was commuting into Children's Hospital. It was a 90-minute one-way trip, and that, you know, it was terrific to lose that, because now I have a, you know, 30-second commute, but, you know, welcome to my home office. But when I started the incubator, my commute went from 90 minutes to 10, and that was definitely an advantage. And so a lot of the people who live up here are delighted. And we have, you know, we have 4 colleges up here that are producing some quite strong students. I'm on the advisory board of Endicott, and their program is really, I'm very pleased with what the students we get from there. And we take interns. I think we've had 275 interns working for companies within the incubator. So some of those are life sciences, some of them are clean tech, but getting a good trained workforce is critically important. And people think they're not going to be able to get that out here because they think you're only going to find that in Boston or Cambridge. No, you can find it here as well, and that helps.
Super. You know, just as we're coming to the end here, I was just curious if each of you or have an experience with a company that did something really clever as they were looking at space, or something that they did really wrong. You know, I find I learn best from lessons and stories. I read a lot of biographies and autobiographies. Just patterns tend to repeat. And I was just curious, have you seen a mistake or common mistakes that people have made? And if so, what is that? Can we maybe share a story or two like that, and in the remaining time?
Yeah, I can share one. Well, I don't know if it's a story, but I would say, you know, when it comes to, you know, making mistakes, I think sometimes not, well, a lot of times we have companies who don't give themselves enough time to make a decision. And they end up kind of getting peddled into just doing a deal, right? You know, there's always a lot of different scenarios you can consider, right? Being thoughtful about the scenarios and being thoughtful about, you know, what the forecast projections look like for your company is something that you should take the time to do, versus just kind of rushing like that. Everyone would like to think this is just kind of a you know, let's just swipe right or swipe left on Zillow and figure out the right option, right? Like, it's not exactly how this goes, right? And we've seen, you know, we've had companies that we didn't work with that, you know, just kind of went off, made a decision, and then we have to kind of come in and clean up certain messes or certain things that weren't really necessarily planned properly, right? Maybe the space didn't have enough equipment. We needed to do electrical power upgrades. And, you know, if the more you can plan, the less money you're going to spend throughout the course of your lease, right? And the more thorough of a deal, you know, the better deal you can negotiate, right? So I think time is definitely a big thing. Sorry?
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just, yes. So time's important. You know, and then also it's hard right now. I think there's some companies who feel like they need to overcommit to too much space, right? Just because the market's crazy. And I think you got to be smart about how much you're really taking on, and you need to be kind of realistic on headcount projections. You know, then again, moves are disruptive, right? I'm not going to sit here and say it's not. They certainly are disruptive. They need to be well planned. And you know, if you don't want to be moving every single year, that can be very disruptive, especially as a team grows, right? It becomes challenging. So eventually you kind of, you know, you make the frequency jump to Hayden Ave and Lexington, and you know, you're going to be there for a bit and can accommodate your growth. So it's a tough balance between, and there's always trade-offs, right? There's a tough balance though between overcommitting and undercommitting, right? But I think the more time you give yourself, the more you can really think about what you need. And you know, you won't have to, you know, be 6 months into a lease either jumping out of the facility or saying, oh geez, what are we doing here? Or I don't have the right infrastructure in place or equipment in place. You know, so you want to be very thoughtful about it, because it's not just, you know, it's not just your people, right? It's your equipment, it's how many what type of chemicals you're using. Like, there's a lot that goes into the process, right? So we've been fortunate to work with so many great companies. I mean, it's been really fantastic. We take a little bit of a different model where we actually pull in, you know, consultants who have spent time in whatever particular science that you're working on in building and operating labs, which is a little bit different from, you know, most of our competitors who focus more so on the market, which is a big component of it. But I think this early stage planning piece of it is really critical to really selecting the right outcome.
We do have, as we're coming to the end here, we do have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you'd like to submit a question through the chat, we can address it to our panelists. See if we have those come in. One thing is, if they need to reach you, Steele, they can reach you through LinkedIn. Martha, you're up at the North Shore Innoventures. You can be contacted through there. And
also on LinkedIn, I'm there.
Yeah. And Rick, I know you're on LinkedIn. It took me a little while to find you. I looked at ours.
No, I am as well, but I mean, I get so much spam from LinkedIn as far as people trying to sell me this, that, and the other thing. If you can tailor your message to, or specifically the incubator question, I'm more than happy to answer.
Very good. Excellent.
I can put my website up on the in the chat here as well.
Okay. We did have one question come in, which is just about, we sort of touched on this earlier. How does a company protect their intellectual property or further IP coming from their research while still sharing a lab space with multiple companies? We sort of touched on that, but is there anything else, suggestions we can share with that person?
I thought Rick actually explained what they do very well. Everybody has their own laptop, and lab notebooks get locked up. I think something that I learned. People coming out of academic labs actually are not generally well trained in properly managing a lab notebook that is going to be needed for protecting IP. And they don't understand about the signatures. They don't understand what needs to be recorded. And I think that it's important to train people in how to maintain a lab notebook. You wouldn't think you'd need to do that, but you do. And I mean, I had a PhD and then went to work in industry and discovered, holy smokes, what the requirements in industry for my lab notebook were entirely different. And it was much more, to keep a GLP notebook that would stand up to FDA scrutiny is a whole different story from what an academic notebook looks like. So that turns out to be a lesson to learn, and you might want to have people train folks in that, and then protecting it appropriately, locking them up. It's highly unlikely that there will be a problem within the incubator, but people are often a little careless, and they'll take their notebooks home and they leave them on a train, and I mean, stuff happens. So that can turn out to be a very important element for your company.
Yeah. So one thing I would add, Martha, is it's not just for experiments. If you have an idea, they can go into your lab notebook as well and have somebody countersign it, and that documents who was involved and the date that the idea was conceived.
That's right. And that determines who gets to be the author on the patent. I mean, that's really important.
So is this something that can be done in kind of in a peer-to-peer manner of this is how you do a lab book in industry, or is this something that like there's a little training course people can go to? I also understand that some incubators may even have kind of a master CDA or something. I think C2I has a CTI, some type of CDA that the organization has or the incubator has.
I don't know about that. We have a sponsor that has electronic lab notebook system that if you're working with a system like that, those are very effective. Mm-hmm. So that's something to consider. I don't know about, it's very difficult to, I avoid taking confidential information. When we're interviewing a company coming into the incubator, we don't want their confidential information, just like investors don't want confidential information from you initially, because it's too hard to figure out what was confidential and what wasn't. Mm-hmm. So people need to learn how to talk about what they are doing in a non-confidential manner. And that, you know, that has to be taught sometimes.
Excellent. Well, we've had an excellent panel today. I'd like to thank Rick, Martha, Steele for your involvement today. Really appreciate your sharing your thoughts. And this will be on the C2I website and also be posted on LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone, for a great panel.
No, thank you for having me.
Thanks for the opportunity. Nice work.
Really glad to participate. Thank you.
See you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.